The first time Alex heard his son scream like that, it didn't just pull him out of sleep. It yanked him back into a memory he'd been running from for years. He was no stranger to nightmares, but the sound of Ethan's terror-stricken voice sent an icy dagger straight to his chest. For a moment, he couldn't move, caught between the instinct to rush to his child and the sick feeling that whatever was in that room wasn't something he could fight. Alex Daniels was a man who prided himself on being rational. At 33, he had mastered the art of compartmentalizing his fears, burying them under layers of practicality. He had to. Life hadn't been kind to him, but he'd learned to adapt. He wasn't the kind of guy to believe in ghosts or monsters or anything that couldn't be explained with logic. But as he sat up in bed that stormy October night, heart pounding, he realized logic wasn't going to save him if something was happening to Ethan. A second scream tore through the silence, high-pitched and desperate. This time, Alex launched out of bed, his feet pounding against the hardwood floor of the narrow hallway as he sprinted toward his son's bedroom. Ethan's door was ajar, creaking slightly as the storm outside rattled the old house. Alex pushed it open, breathless, and found his 6-year-old curled into a tight ball on his bed. Blankets wrapped around him like armor. His wide, tear-filled eyes were fixed on the far corner of the room. "What's wrong, buddy?" Alex asked, kneeling beside the bed and pulling Ethan into his arms. Ethan didn't respond. His tiny frame trembled against Alex's chest, and when Alex turned to follow his son's gaze, the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. The corner was empty, just shadows cast by the old lamp on the nightstand. Yet, the air felt heavier than it should have, like something unseen was pressing down on the room. "It was just a bad dream," Alex whispered, though he wasn't entirely sure who he was trying to convince. Ethan's voice was barely audible. "He was watching me again." The words hit Alex like a punch to the gut. "Who, Ethan? What do you mean again?" Ethan didn't answer. He buried his face deeper into Alex's chest and started to cry. The next morning, Alex sat at the kitchen table, staring into his coffee as though the swirling black liquid held answers. He didn't know what to make of Ethan's behavior. His son wasn't a kid prone to wild imagination. In fact, Ethan was quieter than most kids his age, content with his books, puzzles, and drawing. Since the death of Ethan's mother 3 years earlier, Alex had done everything he could to keep their life stable. They had moved out of the chaotic city to the quieter suburbs, into the kind of house that promised a fresh start. The house wasn't perfect. Old creaky floors, doors that didn't shut quite right. But Alex had thought it would be enough to give Ethan some peace. Yet, something about last night's incident was gnawing at him. He took another sip of coffee and glanced over at Ethan, who was sitting at the small kitchen table coloring in silence. The boy hadn't said much that morning, only mumbling something about not wanting to go back to his room. Alex had let it slide, thinking it was just residual fear from a bad dream. But deep down, Alex couldn't shake the unease. He had felt something in that room. It wasn't just Ethan's terror. It was the oppressive weight in the air, the kind that made it hard to breathe. "Hey, buddy," Alex said, trying to sound casual. "You want to tell me what scared you last night?" Ethan paused, his crayon hovering over the page. He didn't look up. "It's the man," he said quietly. Alex's stomach tightened. "What man?" Ethan shrugged. "The shadow man. He stands in the corner at night. He doesn't say anything. He just watches." Alex forced a laugh, trying to keep his own fear in check. "There's no such thing as a shadow man, Ethan. Sometimes shadows look weird in the dark, but they can't hurt you." Ethan finally looked up, his blue eyes filled with a seriousness that made Alex's skin crawl. "He's real, Daddy. He said you can't see him because you're not supposed to." Alex blinked, unsure of how to respond. Before he could say anything, the sound of the front door opening snapped him out of his thoughts. "Hello? Anybody home?" It was Claire, Alex's older sister. She had a habit of dropping by unannounced, but today Alex was glad for the distraction. Claire was everything Alex wasn't: outspoken, confident, and unapologetically nosy. She walked into the kitchen with a bag of groceries, her auburn hair pulled into a loose ponytail. "Thought I'd bring you some actual food instead of whatever junk you've been living on," she said, eyeing the half-empty cereal box on the counter. Alex managed a weak smile. "Thanks, you didn't have to." Claire glanced at Ethan, who was still focused on his coloring. "What's with him? He looks like he didn't sleep." Alex hesitated, then sighed. "He had a rough night, woke up screaming about some shadow man in his room." Claire's smile faded. She set the grocery bag down and leaned against the counter, her expression turning serious. "Did you say shadow man?" "Yeah. Why?" Claire lowered her voice, glancing at Ethan to make sure he wasn't listening. "Alex, you remember I used to babysit for the Johnsons, right? The family that lived 2 streets over when we were kids?" Alex nodded, unsure where this was going. "They moved out of their house after their youngest son went missing," Claire continued. "I overheard them talking once about how the boy had been complaining about seeing a shadowy figure in his room for weeks before he disappeared." Alex frowned. "Claire, come on. You don't actually believe." "I'm just saying it's weird," she interrupted. "I don't know if it's ghosts or something else, but you might want to take Ethan's fears seriously. Maybe do some digging into the history of this house." Alex wanted to dismiss her words as nonsense, but something in her tone made him pause. That night, Alex put Ethan to bed with extra care, leaving the hallway light on and checking the closet twice before closing the door. He even brought the baby monitor out of storage, setting it up on Ethan's nightstand to ease his own nerves. For the first few hours, the house was silent, except for the occasional creak of the old wood floors. Alex stayed up in the living room, flipping through a stack of bills he couldn't afford to pay. He was just about to turn in for the night when a low, distorted sound crackled through the baby monitor. Frowning, he turned up the volume. At first, it was just static. Then, through the static, he heard a voice, deep, guttural, and entirely inhuman. "You shouldn't have looked." Alex's blood ran cold. He bolted up from the couch and sprinted down the hallway to Ethan's room. When he opened the door, the air felt icy. Ethan was sitting upright in his bed, staring at the corner. Alex followed his gaze, his heart hammering in his chest. There in the shadows, something moved. Something tall, dark, and utterly unnatural. Alex froze. "Daddy," Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. "He's here." Alex sat in the kitchen the next morning, staring blankly at the wall. His coffee sat untouched on the table, steam curling lazily into the air. He hadn't slept. How could he? Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the shadowy figure standing in Ethan's room, motionless but menacing. Its presence lingered in his mind like the acrid smell of burnt wood, refusing to dissipate. Ethan sat at the table across from him, picking at a plate of scrambled eggs. He hadn't said much since waking up, and Alex couldn't blame him. His son's usual chatter was replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional clink of a fork against the plate. Claire had stayed overnight, her protective instincts kicking in as soon as Alex told her what he'd seen. Now she stood by the sink, pouring herself another cup of coffee, her face set in a grim expression. "We need to figure out what's going on in this house," she said, breaking the silence. Alex rubbed his temples. "I don't even know where to start, Claire. I saw it. I don't know how to explain it, but it was there." Claire leaned against the counter, her eyes narrowing. "It's not just this house, Alex. Something like this doesn't just happen out of nowhere. There's history here. There has to be. Weird things like this don't come out of a vacuum." Ethan suddenly spoke, his small voice cutting through the tension like a knife. He said he's always been here. Alex and Claire exchanged a glance. "What do you mean, buddy?" Alex asked, keeping his voice as calm as he could. Ethan shrugged, poking at his eggs. "The Shadow Man. He said he's always been here, but I wasn't supposed to know. He said you're not supposed to see him either." The room went silent. Claire set her coffee cup down with a clatter and turned to Alex. "You need to figure out what's going on before this gets worse." That afternoon, while Ethan played quietly in the living room, Alex retreated to his bedroom with his laptop. He wasn't the superstitious type, but desperation had a way of bending even the most rational minds. He typed "shadow figure haunting" into the search bar and hit enter, bracing himself for a flood of paranormal conspiracy theories. The results were both overwhelming and unhelpful. Hundreds of forums, articles, and personal accounts described shadow figures, dark humanoid shapes that lurked in the corners of rooms, feeding on fear. Some called them shadow people, others dark watchers. Many stories sounded eerily similar to what Ethan had described, The feeling of being watched, the oppressive atmosphere, and the sense of something deeply unnatural. One thread in particular caught Alex's eye: shadow figures in children's rooms, why they're drawn to kids. He clicked on it and found an account from a terrified mother whose daughter had been visited by a shadow figure. The pattern was disturbingly familiar. The child first saw it in the corner of her room, then began hearing whispers. Eventually, the figure became more aggressive, appearing closer to the bed each night. The mother had moved out of the house after the figure started appearing in her own dreams. Alex leaned back in his chair, his heart pounding. Was this what was happening to Ethan? Was it going to escalate? Find anything? Claire's voice startled him. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed. Alex shook his head. Just a bunch of stories. None of them end well. Did you look into the house? She asked. Not yet. Claire sighed and grabbed her phone. Let me do it. You've got enough on your plate. An hour later, Claire returned with a grim expression. This house has a history, Alex. Alex felt his stomach drop. What kind of history? Claire sat down and opened her phone, scrolling through her notes. The house was built in the late 1800s. It's had a ton of owners over the years, and almost all of them reported weird stuff: cold spots, strange noises, and feeling like they were being watched. But it gets worse. Alex braced himself. How much worse? Claire hesitated, then said, in the 1950s, a boy who lived here went missing. He was 7. His parents said he'd been having nightmares about a shadow man for weeks before he disappeared. They found his toys scattered outside, like he'd been lured out of the house. The case was never solved. Alex stared at her, his chest tightening. It's not just this house either, Claire continued. This whole neighborhood has stories like that. Missing kids, strange sightings, people moving out suddenly. It's like something's been here for a long time. That night, Alex found himself staring at Ethan's bedroom door, dreading what might happen if he opened it. He'd promised Ethan he could sleep in his own bed again, but the idea of leaving him alone felt like a gamble he wasn't willing to take. Instead, Alex pulled a sleeping bag from the closet and set up camp on the floor beside Ethan's bed. His flashlight rested within arm's reach, and the baby monitor was turned up to full volume. Ethan was already asleep, his small body curled up under the covers. Alex watched him for a moment, a wave of guilt washing over him. He was supposed to protect his son, and yet here they were, trapped in a house with something he couldn't even begin to understand. Hours passed. The house was eerily silent, the kind of silence that made every creak of the floorboards sound like a gunshot. Alex tried to stay awake, but his exhaustion eventually got the better of him. He woke to the sound of whispers. At first, he thought it was a dream. The whispers were low and distorted, like they were coming from a broken radio. But as Alex's eyes snapped open, he realized they were coming from the baby monitor. He grabbed the flashlight and sat up, his pulse racing. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and he thought he could make out words, though they didn't make sense. Run? Don't look. Mine. Alex turned the flashlight toward the corner of the room, his hand trembling. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating Ethan's toys and bookshelves. But in the far corner, just beyond the edge of the light, something moved. The shadow figure was there, taller and darker than Alex remembered. Its head tilted slightly, as though it were studying him. Alex's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to scream, to grab Ethan and run, but he couldn't move. The figure took a slow step forward, its form shifting and flickering like smoke. Ethan stirred in his sleep, mumbling something Alex couldn't make out. The figure paused, as if waiting for him to wake. Summoning every ounce of courage he had, Alex reached out and shook Ethan awake. Ethan, wake up, we need to go. Ethan's eyes fluttered open, and he immediately froze, his gaze locking onto the corner. He's here, he whispered. I know, Alex said, his voice barely audible. Don't look at him. Just hold my hand and we'll go, okay? Ethan nodded, his small hand gripping Alex's tightly. They moved slowly toward the door, Alex keeping the flashlight trained on the figure. It didn't move, but Alex could feel its gaze, cold and unrelenting. They reached the hallway, and Alex pulled the door shut behind them. He scooped Ethan into his arms and ran to the living room, his heart hammering in his chest. Daddy, Ethan said softly, his voice trembling. He's not gonna stop. Alex didn't respond. He didn't have an answer. Alex locked the front door, bolting it and leaning against the frame, his chest heaving with every breath. He could still feel the cold tendrils of fear gripping him, as if the shadow's presence had followed them out of Ethan's room. Ethan clung to him tightly, his face buried in Alex's neck. "Claire," Alex called out, his voice cracking. "We need to leave. Now." Claire emerged from the kitchen, her eyes widening when she saw them. "What happened? What's wrong?" "He's in the house?" Alex said, his voice shaking. "The shadow. It's not just something in Ethan's imagination. I saw it again. We need to get out of here before it's too late." Claire's face paled, but she nodded. "I'll grab the keys." "No," Alex said sharply. "We're not taking the time to pack or plan. Just grab Ethan and go." Claire hesitated, then reached for Ethan. He whimpered as she took him into her arms, his small hands gripping her shirt tightly. Alex grabbed his phone and wallet, his hands trembling. But as they moved toward the door, the lights in the house flickered. The faint hum of electricity cut out entirely, plunging them into an unnatural silence. "No, no, no," Alex muttered, fumbling for his flashlight. He clicked it on, the beam slicing through the dark. From the corner of the living room, a low, guttural whisper emerged. "You can't leave." The voice was deep and layered, as if a dozen throats were speaking in unison. Alex froze, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "Alex," Claire whispered, her voice quivering. "What do we do?" The air around them grew heavy, pressing down like an invisible weight. Alex could feel it in his chest, constricting his breathing. "Stay close," he whispered. "We're going to the car. Don't look back, no matter what." They moved slowly, Claire clutching Ethan tightly as Alex led the way with the flashlight. The shadows in the house seemed to shift and writhe, forming shapes that disappeared as quickly as they appeared. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, and impossibly loud against the silence. Alex turned the flashlight toward the source of the noise, his heart pounding. The shadow figure stood in the hallway, its form darker and more defined than ever. It was taller now, its head almost brushing the ceiling. Its eyes, or what should have been eyes, were empty voids sucking in the light. It took a step forward, and Alex felt an icy chill wash over him. "Run," he shouted. Claire bolted for the door, Ethan crying out in fear as she clutched him tighter. Alex stayed behind, his flashlight trained on the figure. He knew it wouldn't stop it, but he needed to buy them time. "Stay away from my son," he said, his voice breaking. The figure tilted its head, as if amused. "You don't understand," it whispered. "He belongs to me." Alex's grip on the flashlight tightened, over my dead body. The figure moved faster than Alex thought possible, closing the distance between them in an instant. Its shadowy form enveloped him, cold and suffocating. Alex gasped, his knees buckling as he fought to stay conscious. But then he heard it, a faint voice cutting through the chaos. "Daddy." Ethan's voice was like a lifeline, pulling Alex back from the brink. He staggered to his feet, the flashlight slipping from his grasp and rolling across the floor. The beam landed on the figure, and for a split second, it recoiled, hissing like an animal in pain. That was all Alex needed. He turned and ran, grabbing the front door and throwing it open. Claire was already outside, struggling to unlock the car with shaking hands. "Go, go, go," Alex shouted, shoving them toward the vehicle. They piled in, and Claire finally managed to start the engine. The headlights illuminated the house, revealing nothing but an empty doorway. But Alex knew better. It was still there, watching, waiting. They drove for hours, not speaking, not stopping. It wasn't until they reached a motel miles away that they finally allowed themselves to breathe. Alex checked them in, his hand shaking as he signed the paperwork. The clerk gave him a strange look, but didn't ask any questions. "What now?" she asked softly. Alex shook his head. "I don't know. I don't even know what we're dealing with." Claire hesitated, then said, "We need help, Alex. This isn't something we can handle on our own." "Who do we call?" Alex asked bitterly. "A priest? A ghost hunter? None of this makes any sense." Claire didn't respond. Instead, she pulled out her phone and began searching. The next day, they met with a woman named Dr. Miriam Hale, a paranormal researcher Claire had found online. Miriam was in her 60s, with piercing blue eyes and an air of authority that made Alex reluctantly trust her. After listening to their story, Miriam nodded slowly. "What you're describing is not uncommon in houses with strong residual energy. The shadow figure you saw is likely a manifestation of something much older, something that's been tied to that location for decades, maybe even centuries. Can we stop it? Alex asked. Miriam hesitated. Stopping it is complicated. Shadow entities feed on fear. The more you engage with it, the stronger it becomes. Your best option is to sever your connection to the house entirely. We've already left, Alex said. Miriam shook her head. It's not that simple. If it's attached to you or your son, it may not matter where you go. Alex felt his stomach drop. What are you saying? Miriam leaned forward, her expression grave. I'm saying that as long as it sees you as a threat, it will follow you, and it won't stop until it gets what it wants. That night, back at the motel, Alex sat by the window, staring out at the empty parking lot. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, even here. Ethan was asleep in the bed, his small form barely visible under the blankets. Claire sat beside him, her hand resting protectively on his back. Do you think it's over? She asked quietly. Alex didn't answer, but as the clock struck midnight, the room grew cold. The air seemed to thicken, pressing down on them like an invisible weight. And then, from the corner of the room, a familiar voice whispered, "You can't run." The end. If you enjoyed this chilling tale, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more spine-tingling stories that will keep you up at night. Share this video with someone who loves a good scare and let us know in the comments. What would you do if you saw a shadowy figure in your child's bedroom? Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes it's what you can't see that's the most terrifying. Until next time, stay safe and sleep with the lights on.